Hello, welcome back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here at police headquarters in Washington, D.C. with Chief Robert Contee, who is the Chief of Police here in Washington. And we're going to be speaking about law enforcement and how law enforcement impacts and is impacted by young people. Welcome, Chief.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, thank you, Chief. And maybe if we could start with what I just said, which was about young people. How do you interact with young people as the Chief of Police, and how does this department inherently interact with young people?
Young people, we really try to make them at the core of everything good that we do in law enforcement. And when I say good, I mean our community engagement strategy is really centered around young people, centered around our seasoned citizens, but specifically with our young people, what are the opportunities that we can provide for young people? We recently expanded a program that's near and dear to my heart, our police cadet program, that opened up the door to educate young people, to compensate young people with a salary, to give them health benefits, to do things that allow us to invest in the young people in our city, because they really are the future leaders in this police department, you know, for years long after I'm gone from this department.
Well, speaking of that, it seems to me, though, that young people have wildly different perceptions of the police, as we have seen in recent history. So how do you address people who say, well, the police really don't have the interests of young people at heart?
Well, I think I've had conversations with young people. I recently held a youth summit where we had this conversation with young people, and the interesting thing that I learned in just this conversation with young people is that their perceptions and their understandings of the police is really not, for many of them, not negative interactions that they've had with the police. It's those lessons that have been passed on to them and those thoughts that have been passed on to them from parents, from grandparents, just from some of the historical things, some of the things that are certainly shown in the media. It hasn't necessarily been their experience here in the nation's capital. And I think it's very important that we find ways to really break down those barriers. And again, according to the young people, the way to break down those barriers are for us to find spaces and places where we can engage them in non-confrontational settings, right? I mean, some of them just mentioned basketball, for example. There was a kid who mentioned that a police officer walked up to them on a basketball court. They kind of immediately felt like they had done something wrong, and this was going to be a confrontational situation. The officer just wanted to shoot hoops with them, and after about 5 minutes, you know, this kid really appreciated the way that the officer engaged them. So finding positive ways to engage young people, I think that certainly puts us on the road to making sure that we are having more positive interactions with them than negative interactions.
But what about people who say that there was a reason that they jumped, that student on the basketball court jumped? Sure. How do you address that?
Well, I think we have to be real. You know, look, I'm an African-American male born and raised right here in this city, and I know some of the challenges that people have dealt with over the course of the years, either by perception or real life interaction, negative interaction with the police. And I think that it is really important that we find those, again, spaces where we can engage them in positive interactions. Bringing our young people in to make them a part of our police department, our police cadet program. We have right now about 79 young people from communities of color who have chosen a career in law enforcement, and they've joined the ranks of this department. And I think those are ways that you really start to break those barriers down. When those young people become police officers, they go back to those same communities, and then other young people are seeing them. They're really, you know, not only are they police cadets and on to be police officers, they're also community ambassadors, representatives of the community, and they're able, I think, to really bridge the gap that exists in some places between law enforcement and community members or young people who might see things through a different lens.
Well, if we can shift a little bit to the use of force. Another controversy, as you well know, is, you know, should the police use less force? Some people say, should the police, their hands are tied sometimes. Where do you come down on the use of force?
Yeah, use of force, you know, it's not something that we have to do all the time. I mean, quite honestly, I mean, we make thousands of arrests, and many of the arrests that we make does not require us to use any force at all. But, you know, we also have to be honest. Sometimes there are people who do not want to go to jail. There are people who are armed in communities. Last year, we recovered over 2,400 illegal firearms in the District of Columbia. People didn't just walk up to us and say, hey, here's my gun, officer, please take me to jail. That didn't happen. So understanding that use of force is a part of our job, we take those situations very seriously. It is a last resort, but we certainly want our police officers to be protected, but more importantly, we also want community members to be protected from individuals who might do harm in our communities. And as a part of our work, that means using force. Sometimes it's deadly force. Sometimes it's just physical force. I have never, in all my years of law enforcement, I've never seen a fight that looks pretty, that looks nice, of two people grappling with each other or whatever. I've never seen a nice looking fight. It's ugly business when you are in a confrontation with someone. So to the extent that we can, we want to limit that. We want to do what we need to do with the least amount of force as necessary to bring that situation under control. And if that means that this person who's going to jail is going to jail, then that's what that means. But understanding we're going to do that without taking that person's dignity. We're going to do that without violating that person's constitutional rights. We're going to do that within the parameters of the policies that we have for the Metropolitan Police Department.
But speaking of those policies, it seems to me that one of the difficult things are juggling things in a split-second decision. So all of a sudden, you're in this situation, you don't know what happened 2 seconds before, you arrive on the scene, and you've got to make a split-second decision. One, how do you do that? And two, how do you train people to do that?
Well, it is part of the training. Thank you for bringing that up. And, our police officers are some of the best trained in the country in this space. All of our interactions with community members are recorded on body-worn camera. And certainly, there are people who Monday morning quarterback these interactions between law enforcement officers and community members about what they would have done or what they should have done or how they should have done it. Those things, they happen. But again, just stating for what it's worth, to be engaged in a fight with somebody, whether it's a minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, that's a long time to be in a fight with anybody. And in these confrontations that we find ourselves in as law enforcement officers, to have people to Monday morning quarterback those situations, it's just part of the job. It's part of what we do. I feel confident and comfortable that our officers receive some of the best training in the country, and we certainly, day in and day out, are exploring better ways to make sure that we do that training by putting them in what we call training scenarios, putting the officers through training scenarios where they actually, it's not just about what's in the book, but it's actually creating that environment so that they have an opportunity to experience the stress of having to make a split-second decision, and in a safe environment, being able to go back and kind of coach them through where they may have erred, where they may have jumped the gun and moved a little too quickly. In a situation, I remember a situation back in my day of training where we get a call for a man with a gun, and you're approaching a young man, he fits the description, and you're telling this young man, hey, show me your hands, and he's telling you, wait a minute, and he's putting his hand behind his back, and you show me your hands, and he's putting his hand behind his back, and then he pulls out a card that says, hey, I'm deaf. How do you respond to that in that split second? And, I would even challenge, and we've done this before, a community member, the average person. How do you respond in that situation? We have a facility, our tactical training center, where we actually put officers through these types of scenarios to help them to better understand, that you could find yourself very easily in these situations, and that we also make sure that we take advantage. We look across the national landscape. What are opportunities for training? What didn't go right in this city or this town? And we can use that thing that didn't go right as a training opportunity for the members of the Metropolitan Police Department so that we get it right if we found ourselves similarly situated.
Well, that's interesting. Do other police departments have similar extensive training like that?
Some do, not all. There is not a national standard, if you will, that all law enforcement agencies abide by. I think it's important for people to know that the majority of the law enforcement agencies out there, 94, 95% of them, are 25 member departments or less. That's the majority of the police departments out there. Washington, D.C.'s police department is considered to be a major city police department. We have over 3,500 members as part of our agency. We're like the number 6 largest agency in the country when it comes to major city police departments, and that is significant. We focus on training. We have policies that are from mistakes that have been made in the past, best practices from what we've learned, not just here in our city, but from what we've learned from national and international best practices, quite frankly. We have the advantage to be able to look at those types of things and implement those policies in a large police department, where some other police departments, it's not to knock the smaller agencies, but some agencies don't necessarily have the resources to deploy the way we do with the same type of training, access to the same facilities. They don't have it in their budget to do that. It's expensive.
I suspect that probably is true. So let's say I was a student at UDC or the University of Maryland, and I was interested potentially in law enforcement. What would you ask me to do? What would you ask me to submit, and how would I go about thinking about the next step? And what would you think about in the next step?
Yeah, so the things that we are looking for, really, when you talk about young people, college students, who are looking for careers in law enforcement, it's not what it used to be. I mean, you look at our recruiting advertisement on social media platforms. At one point, it was about the guy who's shooting and maybe got the gun, the big muscles, and rappelling from a helicopter and all that kind of stuff. And for most major city police departments, and to include here in the nation's capital, that's not what you're going to see as part of the brand. Yes, it is part of what we do, but we're looking for people who can be relational, people who can be empathetic with communities, people who have great judgment. And once you decide that this is a place where you want to do that, and you start our process, our testing is geared towards that. When you take the exam, the exam is not about, how well you can shoot or what practice you had shooting coming to a police. It's not about that. It's, does this person have good judgment? Do they exercise good judgment based upon this initial paper review or this test that they're given? It's a national test where people, all across the country can pay to take our exam. And once a person decides, hey, look, this is really the direction that I'm going, we would bring them into what we call a prospect day, where a person would go through a series of different things, a screening process, to see if they can really be elevated to the next level to be considered as Metropolitan Police officers. The great thing that I would say to anyone who's watching really about MPD, we have probably one of the best, arguably one of the best processes in the country, in that a lot of it is very much automated. There is a human element to it, but we can generally get people through our process in about 3 to 4 months. And that is significant. Again, when you have people applying from all around the country, we try to limit the time people would have to travel back and forth to go through our process, and really have streamlined our process to really be a model for a lot of police departments around the country for how you process new applicants into being recruit officers.
And I guess I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about women, and specifically women who are trying to work for the police department.
Yes, that's a great question. The Metropolitan Police Department actually are one of the best agencies, in my opinion, in that space. Just looking at the representation of women, we have about, in a male-dominated law enforcement field, our workforce is about 22% women. We're geared up and really focusing on 30% by the year 2030. That's our goal, 30 by 30, 30% women by 2030. I'm committed to that and really moving us in that direction to be that agency that certainly reflects our community. This is not just a man's job, that kind of thing. We have moms and grandmoms, right, who are police officers. When I say grandmoms, I'm literally saying people who join our department as a second career, they have older children, and now those children have children, and they are now police officers serving here on the Metropolitan Police Department. So we welcome all.
Fair enough. And how do you interact with other police departments in the metropolitan area?
So we have a great relationship with other police departments in the area. The chiefs, I'm a firm believer that iron sharpens iron. So we stay in constant contact, especially on issues that impact where there's overlap in community. Right now, there's a regional issue with carjackings going on. So we're talking, about that issue. This coming, or the weekend of January the 21st, 2nd, and 3rd, we have demonstrations that'll be here in Washington, D.C. So the chiefs from Capitol Police, Secret Service, and United States Park Police and the Metropolitan Police Department and other surrounding agencies, constantly in conversation about, this public safety for the National Capital Region. As much as we are our own separate departments, we really are interconnected because things that, impact this department certainly will impact that department, or you traverse the space of the other. People who are coming to visit Washington, D.C. oftentimes come through Maryland and Virginia to get to our nation's capital. So, in the National Capital Region, you must have strong communication with the area chiefs.
And how do you then deal with issues of the big events, like you just referenced a big event, but there must be tons of big events.
Sure.
But then how do you deal with that versus the kind of regular old streets or regular old shopping centers or regular old bus stops where people just live and do regular things as opposed to things of national importance?
So we have to be able to do both well, right? There is no, this or that. We have to do both well. When we have these large demonstrations that happen in our city, community members still want to feel safe. There's still calls for police service that are going on. And again, it's dynamic in the sense that major city police department are able to do both of those things, maintain the safety and security of the city as it relates to some major event where we have thousands upon thousands of people that are visiting our city to exercise their First Amendment rights, and still looking out for the over 700,000 residents who live here in the District of Columbia, making sure that those communities are safe. So it's really a balancing act of both of those things to make sure that people feel safe on both fronts.
And if you don't mind me asking you this, so a number of people, I assume, are worried about whether or not somebody who has committed a crime is really going to actually go to jail. Do you have a word or two to say about how prosecutors or defense works in the District of Columbia?
Yeah, I mean, it's the justice system. It's a bit complicated. I mean, I would be lying if I said it was not. I think it is. It is a bit complicated, and complicated from the standpoint that I think that some people would probably be surprised at some of the outcomes of things when people exercise poor behavior or commit crimes, rather, in communities. There are certain crimes that when people commit, I'm flabbergasted. Like, how is it that this person is back out in community, with an ankle bracelet on after committing whatever crime they did? But a lot of community members oftentimes are not really aware to that granular level what's happening with individual cases. If I'm a community member, certainly something with respect to elected officials, police personnel, prosecutors, all that kind of stuff. You want to make sure that your voices are represented in those spaces. I think it's very important that our judicial system should really reflect the desires and wishes of the communities that we serve. And if it doesn't, then we need to really go to the drawing board and look at it. Here in the District of Columbia, again, very unique, unlike any other place in the country, where we have the United States Attorney's Office that's responsible or have the responsibility for prosecuting a lot of our local cases. Whether it's a homicide or a theft, our U.S. Attorney's Office will prosecute those cases. Our Office of Attorney General, they prosecute our juveniles, they handle our traffic cases. And so, the U.S. Attorney's Office are not held accountable to the District of Columbia voters. So that in itself is a different dynamic than any other place in the country. So in that space, again, how do you make sure that all of these things are working together. Now, I must say that, we have very strong partnerships. We work day in and day out with the U.S. Attorney's Office, with the courts, et cetera, trying to really make sure that public safety is at the forefront of everything that we do. And sometimes we differ on how we get there. And, with those differences, I think that, it's really the will of the community that should speak, that should really be the loudest voice at the table, right? Is a person who is arrested for robbery, charged with robbery, prosecuted for robbery, sentenced for robbery, what is a sentence that's acceptable to community members? If you are that person that's carjacked, what is an acceptable outcome for someone who's been arrested for carjacking? And if that does not align, with generally what our community members feel, then, again, we really need to look at what we're doing.
But in some ways, that's a political issue, because if you think about it, different people have different perceptions of the way they want society to be, and certainly the police fall into that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you're 100% right. So for me, I look at it, I look at it from a couple of different lenses. One, yes, I am the police chief, but I'm also a resident of the District of Columbia. I lived here all my life. My mother is here. My father is here. We're consumers in the District of Columbia, all of that stuff. And I want them to be safe in community. And if my mother or father were victimized in the District of Columbia, I would like to see someone held accountable for that. If they were arrested by the police, taken through our judicial system, properly charged, et cetera, I would like to see them held accountable for their actions, And sometimes, when you look across the landscape, again, just looking at some of our neighboring jurisdictions, it's like, well, wow, why is it that for robbery, for example, in the District of Columbia, the outcome is this, but if you just go right across the bridge to Virginia to where Pentagon City Mall is, and you do the same robbery over there, the outcome is this? And why are those outcomes different? Are these people any less or more important than the others? No, I don't think so. I think that, again, the communities that are represented, again, by, the folks who get elected, et cetera, I'm not one of those individuals, but I think that our system has to represent that. And when I talk to community members all across our city, I hear people tell me that they are outraged when they hear about, hey, look, this person is out in community after having done this. This person is out in community awaiting their trial after they did that. But the DC is not an anomaly in that place. Certainly there's an article recently, and I mean, check it out. You look at in Chicago, I think there are over 90 murderers in Chicago. And make no mistake, we have some of those here in the District of Columbia that are walking around with an ankle bracelet on, an ankle monitor, awaiting their trial, in part because of COVID, but a murderer is out in community with an ankle bracelet on, awaiting trial. That baffles my mind. And I'm sure for the family of the person who got murdered, certainly that has an impact on them. And I think that has to be taken in consideration too. So it's not a very, it's not just this simple, straightforward issue. There are a lot of issues that are kind of packaged in that. But again, as I move about community, the things that I hear, I haven't heard a community yet say, I don't want to be safe. I haven't heard that yet. And I haven't met a community who say, oh yeah, well, I think people who murder people should be out walking around awaiting their trial.
But let's take your example about the person walking around with the ankle bracelet. But let's say the city council, let's say you go to testify before the city council, or somebody from the city council, the mayor's office calls you and says, well, I have a different view of that than you do. What happens then?
Well, they do have a different view, and this is what I will say to that, and this is what I say to community members all the time. People respond differently depending on their proximity to the pain, right? So if you got carjacked, if your house got burglarized, if the murder happened across the street from your house or to someone that you love, people respond differently to that than if it's over there, if it's not in my neighborhood, if it didn't happen to somebody that I knew or an acquaintance of somebody, but it didn't happen to me. People respond differently to that. See, I'm in the space day in and day out where I'm dealing with people who've been victimized, which probably is a representation of how my thoughts about this. People who have been victimized by crime, people who have been directly impacted, who have lost loved ones or have been victims of this stuff, they feel pretty strong about people being held accountable. I haven't met a person yet that said, hey, look, I know that person robbed me, but he's just having a bad day, or what. I haven't met that person yet. So people respond differently. And I would invite people, I will say all the time, last year in the District of Columbia, we had over 226 murders last year. The year before that, we had 198 murders in the District of Columbia. I've probably stood over more dead bodies than most of the people in this city, quite frankly. But in doing that, you're encountering family members in the process of doing that, people who are grieving because they lost their loved one. Not holding the people accountable when we need to do that as a collective system. Everybody has a role in the system. And again, it's not pointing fingers at any one particular group in the system. It's just simply saying that whatever we're doing, let's make sure that our community, as diverse as the community is, as diverse as the responses are, let's make sure that what's happening really reflects the desires, the wishes, the views of the communities that we serve.
Fair enough. Chief, one more quick question, if I may. The issue of safety tips. I remember hearing a discussion with somebody a while ago saying that the best safety tip in the world was to be in your home between midnight and 5 a.m. Do you agree with that, and do you have any other safety tips?
No, I don't necessarily agree with that, man. I mean, there are people enjoying this city at all times of the day and night. We have very active, robust nightlife in the District of Columbia, in many communities. We have people who come from other jurisdictions in Maryland and Virginia and park in our streets. And unfortunately, just kind of as we examine the data, leave things visible in their cars, and cars are broken into sometimes. So there's a very active community here in the District of Columbia between the hours of 12 and 5. The safety tips that I would say is, obviously you need to use common sense. Don't do things like, leave your purse because you're going into a nightclub, leave your purse on the front seat of your car. There are people in community who, might see that as an opportunity. When we look at our stolen autos, for example, more than half of the stolen autos that happen in the District of Columbia are because of people who are leaving their cars running unattended. That's preventable. That's preventable. Somebody who's delivering food who wants to run really quickly and grab food from this place and to deliver it to that place, but leave their car running in the interim. That's just not using good common sense and not victimizing people who've been victimized. But I think that we have to just use common sense when we're out here operating, moving about in any major city.
Fair enough. And the very final question, very briefly, we only have a minute or so left, I believe. What do you want to say to people who are watching this from around the country who may not be in D.C. or Maryland or Virginia? What do you want them to take from this discussion? Yeah,
well, I think just the focus that it's been on, when we talk about law enforcement here in the nation's capital is really a trendsetter in many respects in terms of how we do business. We are all about getting better every day at what we do in the service of our community, the communities that we serve. It is really, really, really important to me. I have a saying that excellence is transferable, and that is a motto that reverberates through this department in everything that we do, community interactions with people who visit our city. We want to display excellence in all that we say and all that we do. So every opportunity is an opportunity for us to demonstrate that excellence with the people that we encounter. So welcome to DC, come to Washington, DC. We love to have you visit us. This is a beautiful city, and while we are dealing with some of the COVID restrictions, et cetera, this is a great place to be. I love our city. Thank you, Chief Contee. If you would like to reach out to me directly at the show, please go ahead and do so at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.